Okay, hello everyone. I am Mark Albus, and I will be talking about early Chinese loanwords in Old Khmer. Um, I'll be focusing on pre-modern loanwords in Khmer via direct language contact, that is, borrowing directly from the language as much as possible, focusing on that because sometimes the languages have been intermediary donors. Now, Khmer is known for heavy early Indic lexical influence, Sanskrit and Pali, of course, and it is part of this larger Indosphere. Language is also in contact, a significant contact with the Indic languages. This includes Mon, Old Malay, Chamic, Burmese, Thai, but uh, Khmer has also been in contact with the more Sinicized Vedic and later Vietnamese languages, really. And Chinese loanwords, of course, were borrowed in different periods, so different periods of contact with Chinese. So what are some questions I would like to explore? How early was language contact between Khmer and Chinese? So that's something to well, that's the first primary question. And what are the oldest Chinese loanwords in Khmer? Of course, that's always a fun game of finding what the oldest thing is, but it's part of understanding the chronology of things, as I'll talk about. What kinds of early Chinese loanwords are there? It's not enough to just look at the etymology of words individually, but what are the groups of them, these kinds of words? What semantic domains, cultural domains are there? And based on that kind of evidence, what does this indicate about pre-modern Sinitic-Khmeric language context situations? And in fact, that's my larger purpose of this kind of study is to understand the ethno-linguistic history in the region. So these this sort of etymological and historical phonological kinds of studies feed into that, and we have to talk about uh, ethnohistory and archaeology as well sometimes. So, what are the key historical points in pre-Angkorian and Sinitic-Khmeric contact for our purposes in any case, because I'm not a historian and I'm not going into this deeply. The first textual reference to any polity in mainland Southeast Asia and in the Cambodian region, mid-3rd century CE. Uh, Chinese travelers visit Funan. That's sort of a well-known reference where the discussion of the name Funan and Phnom and such. And from the once that happens, Funan becomes part of this tribute system, and it sends envoys to China in subsequent centuries. And moving into the Chunla Kingdom in Cambodia, this continues this sort of these diplomatic and trade relations. So we know that there was some kind of uh, some kind of language contact in this period. And then we jump ahead to the end of the 13th century with Zhou Daguan's observation of local Chinese in Cambodia. And this indicates previous settlements of Chinese speakers. Okay, that sounds good, but that's pretty later than the first millennium. There's really little information about Chinese residents in the Cambodian region in the first millennium CE. And by the way, if you happen to know any references or sources of this kind of information, please let me know. In any case, the linguistic evidence I'll present, I hope, uh, sheds some light on it or allows some hypotheses about the depth and nature of the language contact. So now I want to separate things from other layers of loanwords from Chinese. And there are certainly modern era Chinese loanwords, or let's call it recent era. Um, Southern Min, of course, dialect loanwords, and that's well known in the late to post-colonial period. And words such as this cupboard, tea, vermicelli, Notice also that these are in Vietnamese and Thai, and so when we see these kinds of regional words, we have to be careful where they borrowed indirectly via other languages. And I think there were resident Chinese communities that's well established in the more recent era, and so words such as tu, cupboard, clearly is from Southern Min. It's not from some other variety of Chinese because the onset is T, and that marks it as being from this variety of Chinese and not others. It's, you know, relatively more recent kind of practice, I think. And uh, in any case, these appear to be more recent, and they're not in the early epigraphs, that's for sure. There are no early epigraphs in Angkor Wat showing the word cupboard. Um, and then there are some Chinese words that have been borrowed via Vietnamese, such as this comrade and police. And these are clearly those 20th century types of words. How old that Bang word is, don't know. Um, could be older, of course. But in any case, these I don't believe any of these to be first millennium words. Okay. They're not in the epigraphs, and there is enough information to suggest that they are more recent borrowings. Now, there are some uh, words that are not in Old Khmer epigraphs, but they are found throughout the region, like in Thai and Vietnamese, among other languages. And it's really kind of uncertain timing and source, but I have some thoughts about some of these. And so we can see here the word for sword, some containers such as vase, bucket, bag, box, cage, and then we have kiln and ferry. And of these, I have highlighted this these words here you can see in different color. Sword there, I've marked that one. It's not in the old epigraphs. Yet when we see uh, pictures on bas reliefs in uh, Angkor Wat of Chinese mercenaries holding swords, it is quite reasonable to assume that this word could have been borrowed from some variety of Middle Chinese. Um, it could even have been slightly later, but still early enough. I think it's quite feasible to put this in the category of earlier Chinese loanwords, at least for uh, 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 placeholder hypotheses. Looking at cage with this KR onset, then it becomes a little more interesting because there's this Baxter cigar reconstruction with that KR onset. And in fact, there is a word pretty widespread in Kradai, in Tibeto-Burman, Western Malayo-Polynesian of a kind of grung grung word. The vowel is unexplainable. I don't think, though, that this was borrowed, for example, from Malay with a kind of oo vowel. Um, I think it is at least possible that this could have been borrowed in an early period, but again, it is not in the epigraphs, so we don't have confirmation. And then for kiln and ferry, both of these have these aw vowels um, versus oo, o, which is actually more common among dialects, something oo, o, more a bit higher vowels. And it matches well with Schussler's later Han Chinese aw, and it also happens to match Vietnamese law and da. And so these are, I mean, we could speculate these came via Vietic in an earlier stage, or it could have come from later Han. And for now, I'm going to put these as possible early loan words, even though they're not in the epigraphs. Now let's talk about those early epigraphs. And so some early Chinese loanwords attested in the first millennium in Old Khmer epigraphs. And I'll start with metals. And you'll note quickly that iron and silver are metals and standing ore is not. I'm just trying to save space on the slides. And so iron there is interesting because it has this K final and not a T final. And in Baxter Cigar's Old Chinese Reconstruction with a K, it is interesting. This is not from Dai. This is well before the Dai expansion into the region, these dates of the epigraphs. So I don't think this is chance similarity. It just happened to introduce the word for iron, and it just happens to be similar to early stages of Chinese. Um, I'm going to assume for now that this is a reasonably good candidate for early Chinese loanword, and it is indeed in the Iron Age period here. We might have expected it to be something from Sanskrit or something like that, but that's okay because there's also this word for silver. Now, this word bai, of course, means white, but white plus metal in Baijin in even in the Han Dynasty, it was used to mean silver, as was Huangjin, yellow metal for gold. And in Vietnamese, bạc means silver. That is the word for silver, in addition to ngun, but bạc is the main word for referring to silver. So it's quite feasible. And this is also widespread in that Western Malayo-Polynesian region, like for cage. It seems to be some kind of South China Sea maritime trade word, but I think it's quite feasible for in the Funan period for Chinese traders and envoys and whatnot to have shared this practice for trade. But for iron specifically, and well, metal smithing with these kinds of things, you do need to have some bilingualism, and it's really best if someone is actually living there. And I think this is the first signs of possible Chinese settlement in the region. But again, there's no confirmation from that in from what I know in ethno-archaeological records. For standing or, I know that the vowel doesn't match it quite so well, and I've also marked this Vietnamese form, which is also cheo. So it could be spread around, it could be chance similarity. I'm going to assume, though, that the standing or, which became common in the Han Dynasty in China, uh, based on my uh, uh, limited non-expert knowledge, that sort of technology became spread. And this is, again, a good time for this to have occurred. If this word appears this early in the records, it could have been borrowed again in those early few centuries. Okay, now let's talk about pottery in the epigraphs, pottery terms in the epigraphs. And so we have ceramic dish, small cup, basin, and you can see there Chan resembles somewhat the Middle Chinese form or Chinese reconstruction. And of course, we have to be careful about Chinese reconstructions because it doesn't mean that every variety of Chinese had exactly the same form. But, these are points of reference. Small cup, we can see they kind of match both the Middle Chinese and late Chinese forms. Later Han, I'm sorry, later Han forms, so we don't know. This Shao word actually means a kind of, I don't know, cup-like ladle. In any case, I think it's a reasonable candidate. Ang is pretty solid as a early Chinese loanword candidate. And although we see Ang in various periods here, various stages, the textual date here is a little bit later. So it's actually after the first millennium, but I think that suggests that it was probably borrowed in an earlier period. Um, there's the possibility that it was borrowed via Dai or something like that, but again, I'm going to assume that this period of the second half of the first millennium, when uh, glazed stoneware became common in Cambodia. Uh, this is the time at which these kinds of words begin to appear, including that word kiln that I mentioned before. So it is possible that Chinese speakers helped spread not only the selling of pottery, but also the technology of glazed stoneware, which is a kind of technological innovation. And you know, pottery is much like the Belitung shipwreck that's in Singapore. Um, anyways, I think this is interesting evidence of that kind of language contact and possible settlement. Finally, some words for animals. And the first two, dragon and rabbit, are not the ones that are used to refer to dragon and rabbit in regular speech, but specifically for the zodiac calendar. And that is a topic that has been explored, and I'm not going to spend much time with it, other than to say that the Vedic source of it clearly borrowed those in an early period, Old Chinese Rong and La or Ta, probably at the time that it was borrowed, and that is well retained here. Now, that means borrowing from Vedic, but does that preclude the possibility of accompanying Sinitic speakers? And so I've been entertaining the possibility that these were uh, somewhat Sinicized, perhaps bilingual, bicultural Vedic speakers who also spoke Chinese or had among them Chinese speakers. But that's very speculative, admittedly, but we have to acknowledge that possibility. I don't think it's unreasonable. I think it's actually quite reasonable. Then for donkey, horse is probably a Sanskrit loanword, but donkey is quite evidently a Chinese word, and it matches pretty well the kind of vowel from this earlier period. And uh, that is something else that, not the introduction of horse husbandry, but it contributes to that area of practices, travel practices. Finally, there's this verb to mend, and if this is a Chinese borrowing, and there are some questions, I won't discuss it, but if this is a Chinese borrowing, it's a verb, and it would definitely suggest Chinese speakers being in the community at some point in this early period before these epigraph references. So the semantic categories that we've looked at so far, we've looked at metals, the words for iron and silver, possibly sword. Ceramics, we have ceramic dish, small cup, basin, possibly kiln, that's a pretty good significant group of words. For transport, we have donkey, that's standing oar, possibly ferry. I think that is also a very interesting combination there. And then we have these others, mend, which is the only verb among these, but it is significant just to have a verb. And those zodiac animals, which again comes specifically via Vedic, because I didn't mention it, but the zodiac terms also included some specifically Vedic words such as dog, um, and then cage, possibly. Okay, so what can we get from this? What are some hypotheses we can make? The number of words is modest, and while the early texts clearly date them to the mid or early first millennium CE, uncertainty remains in places. However, I assert there is enough consistency among the data to form some viable hypotheses. One is that the loanwords imply sharing by Sinitic speakers directly from the early first millennium CE of technology and practices, such as techniques in metalworking, such as ironsmithing, ceramics, such as glazed pottery, and some travel issues of transportation. And the sharing of these technological practices implies settlement of Sinitic speakers in Cambodia at some point, or more likely some points in the early first millennium, potentially as early as the third century CE, or I guess hypothetically earlier. We don't really have a way to determine that, not based on what I've seen. So while there are a few details, this study offers data to consider in researching the ethnohistory of Chinese settlers in Cambodia in the first millennium CE. The question now is whether additional informative data can be identified to create a clear picture. So that's what I have to share, and I hope that some of you might have some uh, comments to help, suggestions. Questions, of course, are always welcome. Thank you.